It's great to hear a buzz in the room. It's a sunny day in Oregon. We're going to learn about the amazing history, the Nation of Immigrants concept, which has a whole lot of bearing on our present moment and our future. So I'm Chris Nichols. I'm a historian here at OSU. I'm the director of the Center for the Humanities, and I also help to found and run our Citizenship and Crisis Initiative, of which this event is a part. The initiative started with World War I, the centennial of World War I, so 1914 to 2014. We began asking questions about the relationship between crisis and citizenship, who counts as a citizen, under what conditions, and Professor Ngai, who's here with us, has done groundbreaking work on many of these sorts of questions. And so I'm so delighted to have her here to help illuminate some of them. We've brought in dozens of top scholars. We've done collaborations with National Public Radio, Oregon Public Broadcasting, for town halls. We've done films and discussions, and we've branched out. So now we do a lot of programming on a wider array of topics, which is really exciting. And I see some faces in here, folks who've been to a number of those events. We help sponsor flash panels on events related to, say, nuclear arms and non-proliferation, on the border wall kinds of questions, the immigration ban, and a number of other topics. So look out for these kinds of panels where we're bringing the best insights of history and the humanities to bear on some of the most important questions in the world today. So this is our last event. It's a culmination of our winter term programs, but be on the lookout for some exciting things coming up next term, perhaps the biggest of which is a 2-day conference, May 31st and June 1st, on ideology and U.S. foreign policy, where we'll have 23 scholars from around the world coming in. We'll be presenting all day, both days, nicely catered as well, bringing all kinds of new perspectives on questions of ideas and ideology. And the keynote of that will be on Donald Trump and ideology. And I suspect you will learn something about Trump's ideology if you go to 7 p.m. on Friday, May 31st. There is, in fact, an ideology to Donald Trump. In any case, and the Trump administration more broadly. So a few logistics as we shift into all that. First, please silence your phones. Second, if you need to depart early, please do so quietly, surreptitiously. Third, on format, our speaker will speak. Oh wow, the phone immediately dismisses cash. That's never happened before. Something new every day. So our format is the speaker will speak for roughly 45 minutes. It's usually how we do these, and then we stick around for about half an hour of question and answer, and usually our speakers are willing to linger a little bit longer to talk one-on-one for a few moments. So that's what we'll be looking at here. One last thing to do before I introduce our speaker is to say that thank you to the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion and Director Nicole von Germeden. Thank you to the Dean of Liberal Arts, Larry Rogers. Thank you to the Center for the Humanities, which I helped direct, for pulling this all off. And thank you to Ellen Herman at University of Oregon and the Morse Center. We've been collaborating with them, and part of why we're able to have Ngai here today with us is because of the Morse Center on this collaboration. We're hoping to do more of these kinds of events moving forward. All right, enough of that. We're here to hear from the speaker, not me. So I'm pleased to introduce Professor Ngai. She's a Long Family Professor of Asian American Studies and Professor of History at Columbia University. She's a U.S. legal and political historian interested in questions of immigration, citizenship, and nationalism, renowned for her work on immigration in particular. She's the author of the path-breaking book, Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens in the Making of Modern America, which came out from Princeton University Press in 2004. It won 6 book awards, including the Frederick Jackson Turner Prize from the Organization of American Historians, the Little Griswold Prize from the AHA, the Laura Romero Prize from the ASA, the Theodore Salutos Prize from the Immigration and History Society. And I have one funny anecdote to share about that. As I told May earlier, I had read her Pelzer Award-winning article, The Architecture of Race and Immigration Law, a Re-Examination of the Immigration Act of 1924, just talking about with our lead intern, Amber Tollerud, and which was in the Journal of American History, when I rapidly read her book, Impossible Subjects. And then my first ever honor, very small, as a grad student was to win a travel award. And I was seated next to May Ngai when she won the Salutos Prize for her book. And I was totally in awe, and I don't think I made any good impression whatsoever. Bad impression. Hopefully I made no bad impression. No impression whatsoever. But I got to sit next to her, and I was so proud and so excited. And this is the big award from the IEHS, and it was just a thrill, and I thought, oh, I want to do that kind of work someday. I'm still striving for it. But having her here is just such a wonderful pleasure. She's also written other books. She's written The Lucky Ones, One Family and the Extraordinary Invention of Chinese America, from Houghton Mifflin in 2010. She's the editor of a volume that I bet a bunch of us in history use, Major Problems in American Immigration History. Could go on a bit more. She's the Wayne Morse Chair at the Wayne Morse Center at the U of O this year. She's written on immigration history and policy for the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, The Nation, the Boston Review. And before becoming a historian, she was a labor organizer, which I think in some ways, or at least my reading of her work, is inflected by some of those commitments and some of those efforts. And she's working on two books simultaneously: The Chinese Question, under contract with Norton, a study of Chinese gold miners and racial politics in 19th century California, Australia, and South Africa. And the book on which this talk is based, Nation of Immigrants, A Short History of an Idea. So without going on and on anymore, please help me in welcoming Professor May.
Thank you. I didn't mean to say you made no impression. When you're getting a prize, you're just all psyched up, and all you can think about is the prize you're getting. You too. So, okay, thank you, Professor Nichols, and thanks very much to our Center for Humanities and History, Philosophy, and Religion Department. It's a real pleasure. I've been to Corvallis once before, and I was researching my book, The Lucky Ones, which is about a Chinese American family, because part of that family actually lived in Corvallis. And I went and interviewed the surviving descendant of that family, and they ran one of the first Chinese restaurants, I think, in this part of the state in the 1940s or 50s. And they were the only Chinese in town, so the people they hired to work in the restaurant were OSU students who were not Chinese. Okay, so thank you very much for coming today. I appreciate your interest. I'm sure you all feel very heavily how difficult these days are for immigrants and refugees, and for all of us who care about human rights and social justice. The separation of children from their families, the massing of troops on the border and the tear gassing of asylum seekers, the murders of Jews at a Pittsburgh synagogue, Jews who supported refugees, and most recently, the demonization of migrants to make the dangerous and universal claim that a national emergency exists on the border. These acts by the government and by private citizens overwhelm us. They break our hearts. But despite the president's racism and fear-mongering, the policies of this administration and the violence that they encourage, I believe, are deeply unpopular with a large majority of people in this country, not just among the immigrants. It's common to see the slogan, Nation of Immigrants, invoked at protests, often with images and references to the Statue of Liberty, a premier symbol of America as a nation of immigrants, a welcoming nation. Today, I want to focus on the history of this trope and interrogate it for the normative theories that it encapsulates. Now, perhaps it's overly harsh to scrutinize in this political moment, but if we are to resist, I believe we must have more than slogans. We must have knowledge. Now, when I was researching this lecture, I looked for a photograph that showed the iconic scene of immigrants looking at the Statue of Liberty as they entered New York Harbor. There are actually not that many photographs of such a scene. I chose this one, which shows up repeatedly on the internet. But it's not really a photograph, it's a collage. And if you look closely, you can see there's a drawing of the Statue of Liberty superimposed on a photograph of people aboard a ship. Its creator is unknown, but when credited, it is listed as owned by the Statue of Liberty Ellis Isles Foundation and the National Park Service. Now, the people in this photograph are likely not immigrants arriving in New York. By their dress, they are not steerage passengers, but well-to-do Americans. And by their gesture of doffing their hats, they are likely leaving the city, not arriving. It's also unlikely that they are arriving because the Statue of Liberty faces Manhattan, not the Atlantic. Coming in, one would have to turn one's head to see it. One of the few images that shows arriving immigrants in the statue comes from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper in July 1887, published just a year after the statue was opened. This drawing shows the correct orientation, but it also does not show the immigrants cheering. They're not sad, perhaps contemplative is a better description. This iconic photograph from the 1950s, also ubiquitous on the internet, shows a group of men who are actually being deported. Their orientation indicates a departure from Ellis Island. So let's look a little bit more at the history of the statue. The French abolitionist Edouard de la Vallée, head of the French Anti-Slavery Society, originally conceived the idea for a statue in 1865 to honor African American slaves in their freedom from after the Civil War. He collaborated with the sculptor Frederick Bartholdi, whose early sketches showed a woman who held up a broken chain. Bartholdi ended up using an idea he had proposed in 1869 at the entrance of the Suez Canal, which he had named Progress Brings Light to Asia. He replaced the chain with a book to symbolize enlightenment reason, but broken chains and shackles remain at liberty's feet, and you can see those broken chains and shackles if you go to the statue today. But by the time the statue was built for the United States in the early 1880s, Americans were no longer interested in recalling slave emancipation. So the statue was rebranded as a celebration of American and French republicanism. Congress voted to accept France's gift to the United States, but France paid only for the statue, not the pedestal. The U.S. Congress, the City of New York, and the State of New York all refused to pay for the cost of building the pedestal, about $100,000. So money was raised privately and with much difficulty because people didn't seem that interested in the statue. One of the many fundraising efforts was an art auction. Mark Twain, who was asked to donate something, sent a check and a letter that said, "We don't need a statue." The committee asked Emma Lazarus, a young poet up and coming on the New York literary scene, to submit a poem. Lazarus said, as you can imagine, "I don't write to order." But she submitted a poem. She was the daughter of a wealthy Jewish New York family, and in the 1880s, she had become passionate about the treatment of Jews in Tsarist Russia. Her poem, The New Colossus, was printed in the catalog of the art show, and it drew a little notice, but it was quickly forgotten. It was not read when the statue officially opened in 1886. And Lazarus died the next year, at the young age of 38. The poem was rescued by a friend in 1903 who raised money to have it engraved in bronze. The plaque was placed on the second story of the pedestal where few people saw it. It was rescued a second time in 1936 by Louis Adamish, a Slovenian-American writer who publicized the poem as part of his own passionate advocacy of cultural pluralism. "Give me you're tired, you're poor" became recited in Hollywood films during World War II, perhaps most famously in Alfred Hitchcock's film, The Tour. In 1945, the bronze tablet was moved from the second floor to the statue, where it is today. So the statue has become a symbol of inclusion in America. We are a nation of immigrants. It's the same symbol as the Mayflower, the same idea of inclusion of Martin Luther King. We are a nation of immigrants makes common sense to many people whose own ancestors were immigrants. We are a nation of immigrants is good politics, but is problematic as history. So our relationship to this idea is complicated. Nation of immigrants is not merely a descriptive phrase. Its value lies in its being a normative theory of immigration. First, that immigrants are the central proof that American history is one of progressive inclusions. And second, that immigrants enjoy socioeconomic mobility into the middle class, a theory often known as the American dream. So what I want to do today is historicize nation of immigrants? Where did this idea come from? And how did it become to embody so much meaning? And second, I will examine the question of social economic mobility by comparing the occupational status of each generation and the second generation of the two great waves of immigration to the U.S. at the turn of the 20th century and in our own time. The concept that America is a nation of immigrants is a relatively new idea born in the post-World War II period and popularized perhaps most famously by John F. Kennedy. In 1958, Kennedy, then a senator from Massachusetts and himself the descendant of an Irish immigrant, published a little book, Nation of Immigrants. The book promoted a historical narrative that the United States is and has always been a nation of immigrants, and celebrated the achievements of Americans of foreign birth, such as Carl Schurz, Andrew Carnegie, Samuel Gompers, Albert Einstein, etc. The purpose of the book was to advocate for immigration reform legislation in Congress. As Senator, Kennedy had sponsored bills to ease restrictions on foreign adoptions, and he co-sponsored the Leland-Humphrey bills that would have repealed the national origins quotas. Those quotas, in place in 1994, exclusively and grossly discriminated against immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Great Britain, for example, enjoyed an annual quota of 34,000, Germany 51,000, which quotas were left mostly unused, while Italy's quota was 5,800, Hungary 473, and Greece 100. The national origin quotas were the triumph of 2 decades of nativist agitation against the so-called new immigrants, Jews, Italians, and Slavs, whose labor powered the industrialization and urbanization of the United States, but whose presence offended native white elites and skilled workers on grounds of cultural difference and economic competition. As president, Kennedy sponsored an immigration bill that repealed the national origin quotas, but he was assassinated before that was passed, and afterwards Lyndon Johnson took it up and ultimately it passed as the Hart-Celler Act of 1965. In the run-up to the 1965 Act, the book was reissued with an introduction by the late president's brother, Robert Kennedy. And in 2008, the book was again published, this time with an introduction by Senator Edward Kennedy, who himself was a champion of immigration reform during the first decade of this century. The Nation of Immigrants tells a very simple story about continuous waves of immigration since the colonial era and the contributions of immigrants to the building of the nation. Contributions they made as farmers, workers, and consumers, as scientists, artists, and writers. Each successive wave faced difficulty and hardship, occasionally discrimination, but each eventually climbed the ladder of social economic mobility and realized the American dream. This is a narrative, I think, that is probably familiar to all of us here, but it was a new idea in the post-World War II era. Now, the first pamphlet, the one on the left, published in 1958, was a modest little pamphlet. It was just 40 pages, of which 15 were devoted to an analysis of policy and recommendations for reform. The second edition, published in 1963, came out by Random House, and it was enlarged to 160 pages. The text was the same, with some subtle revisions. The original section, called Waves of Immigration, was divided into 2 chapters, one on the pre-revolutionary forces and a second on the post-revolutionary forces, with the American Revolution being the dividing line. In effect, establishing a periodization divided at 1776. Now, those of us who study and teach immigration history would find this a rather strange periodization. But it accomplished 2 things. First, by noting the early Dutch, French, Huguenot, Swedish, Irish, German, and other settlers alongside the English, it downplayed the role of the English and rewrote European empire building as diverse immigration streams. Second, by placing all subsequent immigrations into one post-revolutionary chapter, it emphasized continuity and made immigrants who came at the turn of the 20th century, those who were targets of the national origin quotas, but the latest wave in a long succession of waves. Now, A Nation of Immigrants focused entirely on Europeans. There was no discussion of Mexican or Asian migration, reflecting conventional thinking that these were temporary migrants, birds of passage, and sojourners. One paragraph described the Exclusion Act, noting it as an exception to the historical practice of non-discrimination and inclusion. The picture gallery of notable immigrants included just one person who was not a European, the Japanese scientist Ngai. The second edition continued to erase Mexicans and other Latinos from history, but it did give Chinese more attention, no doubt owing to Cold War politics. Since the text itself could not be changed, the editors included Chinese in the book's glossy photo inserts, with many photographs and several references in the captions, which were substantial and by themselves constituted a kind of mini narrative. So a reader who perused the book by looking at the photo section and reading the captions without reading the book itself, common enough practice, might come away with an understanding that Chinese held a respected place in immigration history. Yet the Cold War politics that animated this effort at inclusion also directed the continued exclusion of Japanese Americans and the other major Asian ethnic group in America, perhaps owing to the embarrassment of the recent wartime. Now, the third edition of the book, issued in 2008, tackled the issue of Latinos, but only indirectly, by adding a map, appendices on chronology, major legislations, and a bibliography that incorporated Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and Latinos. Senator Edward Kennedy's introduction did not mention Latinos explicitly, but highlighted the need to legalize the undocumented population, which was an oblique reference to the Latinos in the United States. Nevertheless, readers of the book in 2008 would have been struck by its Eurocentric orientation. Now, this book by Kennedy, Nation of Immigrants, did not drop from the sky. It was the direct product of the liberal movement to repeal the national origin quotas. The Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith suggested to the senator that he author a short book on this subject in order to assist in immigration reform efforts. Throughout the 50s and 60s, the Anti-Defamation League published scores of books and pamphlets, many of them commissioned to academics, which aimed to combat not just anti-Semitism, but racism, nativism, and religious intolerance in general. One can get a sense of the project from the titles of their publications: Civil Rights and Minorities, Negro American Intelligence, Privacy and Prejudice, Religious Discrimination in Social Clubs, and Prejudice, How do People Die? Now, these efforts were characteristic of the belief held by many post-war liberals and social scientists that prejudice was born of ignorance and could be resolved with education and persuasion. Francis Brown, a sociologist, explained at the time, quote, "The whole problem of minorities must be approached from the point of view of modifying basic attitudes. The first step is knowledge and appreciation for the contribution of each group," unquote. Now, when the ADL pitched the idea for a nation of immigrants to Senator Kennedy, it offered an outline that was prepared by Arthur Mann, one of Oscar Hanlon's first doctoral students at Harvard and then a young history professor at Smith College. Hanlon, who we credit with founding the academic field of immigration history, was also active in post-war liberal causes. He wrote several books for the ADL and served as an immigration consultant to New York Senator Herbert Lehman. And indeed, Kennedy's Nation of Immigrants quotes the famous first line of Hanlon's 1952 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Uprooted, quote, "Once I thought to write a history of immigrants in America. Then I discovered that the immigrants were American history." But Kennedy, or more likely his staff writers, drew from Hanlon only in a partial and superficial. Hanlon's view was not merely celebratory. In fact, he believed immigration history had already moved beyond the compensatory stage to yield larger lessons about American national development. His claim that the immigrants were American history actually carries a double meaning. The familiar one about immigration waves and heritages, but also his theory that the alienation and eventual assimilation of immigrants exemplified the more general process of Americans' transition to modernity. Hanlon bore an ultimate faith civilization and modernity, how America's progress and growth came about. He argued that key transitional experiences were known to immigrants and the native-born alike: the move from the countryside to the city, the breakup of village and small-town life, the transformation of the family, the alienation of factory work, and the city. Notably, Hanlon saw in American civil society venues that promoted assimilation and which constituted the linchpins of democracy. He counted among them the immigrant groups, voluntary associations, and ethnic newspapers. Now, historians have long since rejected Hanlon's thesis that European migrants in the 19th century and early 20th were pre-modern peasants who lived outside of capitalist market relations, and we no longer subscribe to Hanlon's assumptions about assimilation. But my point here is that he offered a critical analysis of immigration inclusion as part of America's development as a modern industrial society, and was a historical analysis. But that analysis became erased in popular histories. He emphasized celebratory history and perhaps more perniciously teleological histories that posited inclusion and assimilation as normative processes of American development. In this vein, Kennedy's Nation of Immigrants exemplified what some of us have called the racial liberalism of the post-war period, an outlook toward racial reform most famously captured by Gunnar Myrdal, a Swedish sociologist, in his book An American Dilemma, published in 1944 on black-white race relations. In that book, Myrdal wrote, quote, "This country has a national theory, if not a consistent practice, of freedom and equality for all. What America is constantly reaching for is democracy at home and abroad. The main trend in its history is the gradual realization of the American creed," unquote. That view established what American studies scholar Nikhil Singh has aptly described as, quote, "the rhetorical framework in which the liberal perfectionist emphasis on racial reform is something that is paradoxically already accomplished and something that is never quite complete." Now, Hanlon and Kennedy articulated the exceptionalism of the American creed in a Cold War frame. Nation of Immigrants is a nationalist history that was preoccupied with the projection of American democracy abroad. Their view was at a considerable remove from a more cosmopolitan trend of liberal pluralism in American politics, which was best captured in the 1930s and 40s by Louis Adamich, who I just mentioned as having moved the plaque to the base of the Statue of Liberty, and who wrote the best-selling book Nation of Nations in 1944. Adamich, who came to the United States from a Slovenian village when he was 13 years old, was a keen observer of American race and ethnic relations. As a boy in his hometown, his home village of Carniola, he had listened to the stories of returned migrants and was awestruck that ordinary workmen, quote, "could make pots of money in a short time, acquire immense holdings, wear a white collar, and eat white bread, soup, and meat on weekdays," unquote. After coming to the United States and traveling across the continent in the 1920s, he was struck by the ordinariness of, quote, "physical freedom unimaginable in the old world. But at the same time," he said, "I saw this vast and free land was crisscrossed with cultural walls, sheltering snipers, bearing ill-considered posters, casting shadows, keeping men from the other, preventing the full flowering of life," unquote. Adamich saw that immigrants' lives were ruled by, quote, "haphazardness, chaos, violence, and accident," unquote, which he attributed to complexities of freedom, democracy, individualism, and capitalism that he defined as the, quote, "fantastic United States." Adamich came to believe that immigrants held the promise of a possible spiritual and intellectual awakening and flowering of America. The early American stock, he believed, was, quote, "emotionally, spiritually, and intellectually flat, for generations pickled in the sour juices of Puritanism, or dried over the sacrificial fires on the altars dedicated to that great God work," unquote. When he wrote Nation of Nations in the 1940s, he had concluded that, quote, "the fallacy of American history as an Anglo-Saxon nation was was diffused throughout our national life and thought like a fog rolling about, spreading everywhere. What was ultimately desired, he said, was a reorientation of the American state of mind, a reevaluation of facts of the American story, so that immigration might cease to be a footnote and become the main subject of the text, so that each group in our population would be seen as a necessary and integral thread. The pattern of America is all of a piece, he said. It is a blend of cultures. Diversity is itself the pattern, the stuff and color of the fabric. Now, Adamich's pluralism differed from that of Kennedy and Hanlon's in some important respects. They all bore faith in the exceptional promise of American democracy, but whereas Adamich saw immigration injecting new life into national complacency, Hanlon and Kennedy emphasized the immigrants' absorption into the nation. Adamich saw America connected to the world by its immigrants, and the Second World War was a wake-up call to the experience of decolonization that anti-racism domestically and internationally. In this NBC radio program with the University of Chicago social scientist in 1944, he noted, quote, "The unfavorably situated peoples all around the world are stirring and heaving toward self-improvement, toward industrialization and higher productivity, toward uniting with one another in common causes of self-realization and development. I am afraid that some of our jingoes will presently begin to talk of, quote, the yellow peril, well, it seems to me that the chief danger actually exists within the white people themselves," unquote. Hanlon and Kennedy considered the world from the vantage point of nationalism and interest. In this view, segregation and national origin quotas were foreign policy embarrassment and hence required reform, but reform that would be the interests of the U.S. nation state. At the same time, Hanlon and Kennedy, while committed to civil rights, also tended to think about African Americans and immigrants as different problems, creating distinctions between race and ethnicity. Adamich viewed the so-called Negro problem as a national question and considered racism against blacks and immigrants to come from the same fount of white Anglo-Saxon superiority and capitalist exploitation. But Adamich, like other progressive anti-racist leftists in the 1940s, like W.E.B. Du Bois and Carrie Williams, and their more radical views about democracy and critiques of capital, would marginalize the essence of anti-colonialism, domestic politics, and foreign policy. The Cold War iteration of Nation of Immigrants completes to us a nationalist interpretation of the citizenship view that has been hard to shake, even as new paradigms emerge in immigration history. The post-Hanlon generation of immigration historians rejected the idea of assimilation and theorized ethnicity as an invention that managed a negotiation between cultural persistence and adaptation. It viewed ethnic formation as the product of a dynamic interaction between immigrants and the host society, not a one-way assimilation into Anglo norms. They reprised Adamich's view that the pattern of American history was one of diversity, but their view remained U.S.-centric and left unchallenged the idea of migration as a unidirectional phenomenon. Leaving another generation of historians to write about Chicano, Latino, and Asian immigrants, and to reframe the study of American immigration into the context of colonialism and racism and open the way for transnational histories. Nation of Immigrants has always been a slogan tied to immigration reform, and so it is taken up again in our own time. We have our latest version of the wave theory. In its essential characteristics, today's immigrants are like all others who came before. But this approach is ambivalent and misleading. It obscures other dynamics of American history that cannot be and should not be explained as immigrations, that is, settler colonialism, the conquest and removal of indigenous peoples, slavery, and the acquisition of lands. A better approach, I argue, is to periodize the arrival of newcomers as they coincide with the major periods in history. In this graph, I offer my own periodization of immigration. And I'll just note that the data begins 1820, not because that's when people first started coming, federal government first started to record entries. I break out the periods of colonial and national settlements, followed by the two great waves of labor immigration, which occurred at the turn of the 20th century and again at the turn of the 21st. So using these 2 points as comparison, I want to talk about the second part of the Nation of Immigrants theory, the American dream. If Nation of Immigrants is a theory of normative inclusion, a key part of that theory is the concept of assimilation. Assimilation is the normative expectation of immigrants. Most commonly, this is known as achieving the American dream, that is, the rise into the middle class. The theory says that the American dream is available to all if immigrants embrace the American values that esteem education, hard work, and individualism. So I'm going to investigate this claim by way of comparing and contrasting the trajectories of immigrants and their children at the turn of the 20th century and at the turn of the 21st. And certainly there are many similarities in these two immigration periods, which make them appropriate for comparison. Both were mass labor migrations, the first almost entirely comprised of unskilled workers, and the second, in our own time, comprising both higher and lower skilled workers. But both were integral to major structural changes in the global and domestic economy. In the late 19th century, economic development in the world's core regions attracted mass immigration from rural peripheries, where capitalist penetration of the countryside disrupted subsistence economies. Those migrations were both regional and transoceanic. Immigration to the United States from southern, central, and eastern Europe, as well as from China and Mexico, provided the muscle for industrialization, for building America's cities and railroads, and for opening the West to mining, agriculture, and manufacturing. In the late 20th and early 21st century, immigration has been integral to another economic restructuring, one that's also global, one that involves the rise of the finance and service industries and a decline in manufacturing in the United States. Domestic manufacturing has not disappeared, but many of the jobs are gone, either as production moves offshore or becomes automated. Immigrants are not taking jobs from the native-born in manufacturing. Rather, they mostly work in the service sector, in construction, and in industrial agriculture and food processing. Immigrants at the turn of the two centuries are similar in their employment in segmented labor markets, their settlement in ethnic enclave communities, and the myriad discriminations they face. The arguments of nativist opposition are strikingly the same at both times. Immigrants are criminals, they don't learn English, they don't want to become Americans, their religion is different, they bring radical politics, they take jobs from Americans, and on and on. The same complaints made that you hear today were made 100 years ago. Yet many people today point to the immigrants at the turn of the 20th century as models of assimilation and upward mobility, while casting today's immigrants as failures. This involves downplaying the difficulties that all first-generation immigrants face, but more important, comparison is made to the success of the second generation of the immigrants who came 100 years ago. Upward mobility certainly seemed to be the case for the children of European immigrants that came in the early 20th century, the immigrants who worked in the garment factories and steel mills, and the children who became professionals and settled in the suburbs after World War II. And in general, yes, the children and grandchildren of the Europeans did achieve a remarkable rise in their social economic status, as measured by occupation and income by mid-century. So let's take a little closer look at that history. I'm going to show you data from 1950 in the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area, showing the occupational position of Jews and Italians, first and second generation men and women. The Jewish experience is distinctive in many respects because Eastern European Jews tended to come in family units and hence were permanent settlers and had, generally speaking, higher levels of education. And many came with some skills like tailoring or retailing. So here we see that among first generation Jewish men 55% are white collar or professionals. Nearly 40% are machine operatives or skilled workers, mainly in the Jewish trades. We should note that the people at the category of managers and proprietors is a very diverse category. It includes people who are small shopkeepers, but also peddlers who are very poor. Women are concentrated in the sewing factories as machine operatives. These data are not detailed enough to show the gender gap in the garment industry, where men worked in higher paid positions in skilled jobs as cutters and pressers or sewing menswear, which required more skill and commanded higher wages than women's shirtwaists. In the second generation of Jewish men and women, we see that they've moved almost entirely out of blue-collar work and entering office work, business, and the professions. Now, if we look at Italians, we can see that common labor was prevalent among immigrant Italian men. They were the proverbial pick and shovel workers who built the subways, streetcar lines, and sewers in early 20th century cities. By 1940, common labor was a thing of the past for both first and second generation Italian men. By mid-century, Italian men have moved up to factory jobs and the construction trades, the latter becoming ethnically exclusive enclaves and bastions of economic security. The second generation of Italian women in the garment industry moved up into the offices and sales jobs. Among Italians, there were fewer professionals than among Jews, but the rate of increase is about the same, around 100%. Another way to look at mobility and assimilation is by the ethnic wage ratio, comparing immigrant and second-generation wages to the wages of native-born white Americans. So these are, can you guys see this? These are the ratio, the percentage of first generation, which is blue, and second generation, which is orange, the ratio compared to native white wages, which is the percentages on the left column. You'll note that for the second generation, it's a mistake. No. Sorry. All right, I'm going to try to do that. We'll note that for the second generation, it depends on the cohort, meaning the birth cohort. The second generation in 1910 is doing barely better than their fathers, but they are still at 62% of native white wages. By 1940, there's still an ethnic disadvantage. But what's interesting is that both immigrants and their sons are at about the same level. We can say that while European ethnic groups are doing better and closing the gap with native-born whites, the second generation is not really doing that much better than their parents. They continue to rise together and reach near parity with native-born white wages, 95% by 1960. This is a process that takes more than 50 years. So what can we conclude from these data on occupational and wage mobility? Yes, there's a steady rise, but it's slower than one might think. And the success story really only pertains to the last cohort of the second generation, those born around 1920, or the third generation. So the familiar boast we all know, my son the doctor, is more likely to be my grandson the doctor. Okay, so let's look at, so on the left I've reproduced the data of European ethnic wage ratio and comparing it now to Mexican, the ethnic wage ratio for Mexican immigrants, the second generation in the later decades of the 20th century. And I'm sorry, I'm missing data on the first generation from 1980. But what we can say is that Mexican male immigrants in 1970 did about the same as European immigrants in 1920 compared to native-born whites, with an ethnic wage ratio of 65%. But over time, neither they nor their sons have risen. In fact, they've actually gone backward. For Mexican American men, that is, Mexican Americans born in the United States of working age, the ethnic wage ratio in 2000 was 48%. This gap is produced in part perhaps because of rising income inequality. So the top 1%, which is mostly white, might be inflating the average native white wage. So taking into account that possibility, we'll look at it another way by looking at in terms of dollars. In the 5 southwestern states, personal income of U.S.-born Mexican-American male workers age 18 to 54 dropped from $29,000 a year in 1970 to $26,000 in 2000. For non-Hispanic whites in the region, personal income rose over the same period from $43,000 to $44,000. In the Southwest, which is still home to a majority of ethnic Mexicans, U.S.-born Mexican Americans, not just immigrants, remain at the bottom of the economic hierarchy in 2000. Lower incomes than that of African American Americans, income has risen, although at a slower rate than whites. Now, if we look briefly at education, education is important because social scientists consider the level of education to be the most important variable with regard to occupational status and mobility. Here we see that Mexican Americans' rate of high school and college graduation lagged far behind that of non-Hispanic whites. Perhaps most disturbing, we see stagnation at the second and third generation and even decline thereafter. So I think this is shocking that in 1965, 2 to 4% of U.S.-born Mexican Americans graduated from college, and today it's only 13. It's gone from 13 to 6%. So how do we understand these different trajectories? One major strand of assimilation theory places prime importance on culture, education, hard work, and individual ambition. A lack of these values reflects cultural deficiencies and results in failure to advance, so the theories go. There are variations of the idea from Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations to Amy Chua's Tiger Mother theory. Many Americans hold some version of it, especially those who believe that they personally worked very hard for their own success. Now, I don't think culture is irrelevant, and I don't have time to talk about culture today, but I just want to say that it's a poor causal explanation for mobility. As a general phenomenon, all immigrants work hard. They all want their children to do well in school and to succeed. Worse, the cultural argument promotes bad stereotypes. To say that Mexican immigrants don't learn English is to ignore the fact that all first-generation immigrants tend to be monolingual in their mother tongue. To say that Asians value education because of Confucianism does not explain the educational achievement, say, of Americans of Asian Indian descent who do not have a Confucian tradition, or the low academic outcomes among Koreans in Japan, or among Chinese in Spain and Italy. Another common explanation is racism. The European ethnic, some say, became white, so to speak, whereas Mexicans face continued racialization, which has limited their access to better jobs. Now, while this is certainly the case, this view underestimates the racialization of immigrants at the turn of the 20th century, Jews, Italians, and Slavs who were called the degraded races of Europe, declared inferior to Anglo-Saxons. They certainly faced employment discrimination in the early 20th century, and just as we saw, it took 3 generations to close the wage gap. The so-called whiteness theory, while pointing out a convergence of European ethnicity and white racial identity around mid-century, does not offer a clear causal explanation for mobility. That is, if whiteness enabled assimilation, what caused the whitening of ethnicity in the first place? And if assimilation is not the product, but an enabler of whiteness, then how do we explain assimilation? A better explanation, I believe, for the disparities in social and economic mobility lies in larger contexts of American society, which at different historical moments has structured different conditions of possibility for mobility. We should remember that the European immigrants at the turn of the 20th century were almost entirely workers in low-wage, low-skilled jobs. their children and grandchildren at mid-century had better prospects for entering the middle class for a variety of reasons. Most broadly, there was a large-scale transformation and expansion of the economy after World War II, which created a new array of opportunities, not just for immigrants, but for all Americans. In the 40-year period between 1930 and 1970, these included a decline in agricultural work from 21 to 3% of the workforce, a robust expansion of white-collar jobs from 29 to 45%, especially in technical and professional occupations. And although nearly half of the total workforce remained in the blue-collar and service jobs, the proportion of unskilled labor declined by 2/3, from 11 to 4%. The children of sweatshop workers and common laborers with just a high school education could, in the 1950s, get a job in basic industry or the building trades, jobs that were better paying, usually with union representation and stability. These jobs enabled them to move to a neighborhood outside of the ethnic community, often with better schools for their children. An associate's or bachelor's degree credentialed one to work in new growing industries that demanded technical and professional skills. Indeed, during the post-war period, there was a rapid expansion of higher education into a mass system that provided an educated workforce for jobs in burgeoning fields like healthcare, telecommunications, legal services, pharmaceuticals, aerospace, etc., etc. There was an explosion of state university systems, especially in the creation of community colleges and four-year colleges across the country. The state university system of California and the State University of New York system are exemplary in this regard. SUNY, for example, in my state, was founded in 1948 by bringing into one public system 30 previously independent colleges, which enrolled fewer than 30,000 students. By the early 70s, SUNY had 72 campuses and more than 350,000 students, most of them from European American backgrounds. Importantly, the GI Bill was a major social welfare program of government support for college education and low-interest home mortgages for World War II veterans. These helped white ethnics buy homes in the new suburbs that were popping up all over the country. In just a single decade, from 1950 to 1960, the population in suburbs rose by nearly 50%. And although the GI Bill was formally codified, whites benefited far more than blacks. The suburbs were racially exclusive by law and then by custom. African Americans, long subject to inferior segregated schools and excluded from colleges, could not take advantage of the educational benefits of the GI Bill to the extent that whites could. Historian Ira Katz-Nelson aptly called the GI Bill an affirmative action program for white people. These benefits from the welfare state combined with reforms that lowered discriminatory barriers. For example, Ivy League quotas against Jews began to end in the 1950s. The LSAT was first given in 1948 to base law school admissions according to merit, not legacy or family connections. And finally, nearly all European immigrants were legal. In the late 20th century, we have a very different situation. The children of low-wage, low-skilled immigrants do not enjoy the same opportunities as their counterparts at mid-century. They face vastly different conditions, increasing economic inequality, economic restructuring with a high end and a low end and a vanishing middle. A high school education alone can no longer get you a good paying job. The evisceration of public education, especially in our cities. The impoverishment of social welfare, including laws that made illegal immigrants ineligible for social welfare benefits like food stamps and Medicaid in the 70s, and made legal immigrants ineligible for 5 years in the 1990s. And finally, undocumented immigration, which is perhaps the greatest barrier to mobility. The Nation of Immigrants theory of assimilation and mobility was invented by one particular cohort of one particular generation in the post-war era. They took their own success and read it backwards onto all of American history, and they projected it forward as a normative theory of mobility and inclusion without regard for the historical, economic, social, and political contingencies that enable their achievements. So to conclude, I just want to say a few words about the present moment and what the prospects are for immigrants today. We are, as I said in the beginning, living in dire times. It is noteworthy that the administration's fear-mongering at the border for the wall has reconfigured asylum seekers as illegal aliens. This policy has little legal grounds, but it stokes nativism and racism. But the immigrant rights movement has been building for several decades. It is organization and leadership, and it has support and allies. It demonstrates in the streets, it holds Know Your Rights sessions, it fights in court, which is the only branch of the government right now that stands up for immigrant rights, at least for the time being. Federal judges held up the Muslim ban for over a year, have upheld local sanctuary policies, forced the administration to return children taken from their parents at the border, even ordered a plane turned around to return an asylee who was unjustly removed. The politics of nativism, racism, and hate are not the politics, I believe, of the majority of American people. The Nation of Immigrants continues to resonate with many Americans, and for good reason, but it's also a problematic concept that distorts history and places undue burdens on today's immigrants. I propose a different theme that emphasizes history and change alike. Immigrants make and remake the nation.